Commission public meetings are typically held the first and third Tuesdays of each month, and both of these meetings provide opportunities for the public to address the Commission. All persons are encouraged to participate in public meetings, and any citizens requiring translation, sign language services, or other reasonable accommodations may contact the city clerk's office. Requests need to be made at least 2 days in advance of the meeting, 2 business days, and commission packets are available online at the Legislative Information Center or on the Friday prior to the meeting on the first floor of City Hall. We will start with a roll call on the meeting.
Commissioner Ackerman, Commissioner Briggs, Commissioner Klein.
Here.
Commissioner Gibb Randall. Commissioner Mills.
Here.
Commissioner Milstein.
Here.
Commissioner Trudeau.
Here.
Commissioner Weatherby.
Here.
Commissioner Woods.
Here.
A quorum by the hair of our chinny chin chin.
Wonderful. So we do have a quorum, and that will take us to our next item, which is approval of the agenda. Can I have Commissioner Mills moves the agenda? Is there a second? Commissioner Milstein. Any discussion on the agenda for this evening? All in favor, please say yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Item 4 is introductions, and we don't have any this evening. So we'll go to item 5, which is minutes of previous meetings. We have 2 from October 3rd and November 8th. Can I have a commissioner move those? Commissioner Mills again, Commissioner Milstein again. They're the quickest hands tonight. Any corrections, discussion of those meeting minutes by anyone? No? All in favor of the meetings as presented, please say yes.
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Those are accepted. Next, we go to our reports from city administration, city council, planning manager, planning commission officers, committees, and written communications. We normally start with city council, but our representative is not here this evening. So we're going to start with the planning manager, Mr. Leonard.
I will do my best to fill a shadow of his role. Since your last regular business meeting, there's been a variety of actions that City Council has taken on Planning Commission petitions. 2857 Packard Road, the proposed site plan that the Planning Commission recommended for denial, was also denied by City Council. A development agreement with Grace Bible Church was terminated. This was a development agreement associated with a previous development that never went forward, associated with a land division at that location, so that was terminated. The 1140 Broadway proposed development was approved for both rezoning, site plan, and associated brownfield plan. The 2945 Devonshire rezoning, a single-family property, was rezoned. 2410 Newport was approved for annexation and starting that process, as is 2883 Stone School Road. The medical marijuana zoning proposed ordinance was adopted last evening by the City Council. The only change to that proposed ordinance from the version that Planning Commission recommended was a reduction in the separation requirements of between provisioning centers from 1,000 feet to 600 feet. The City Council also passed a companion resolution that would provide that an attestation for facilities that are currently in operation, which is a requirement for the state of Michigan for those existing facilities to be able to apply for state licenses. The Glen Hotel commercial and multifamily residential plan unit development and site plan was approved last evening. The proposed Anglis House Historic District, while not a recommendation specifically of the Planning Commission, it came to you for comment. That was denied by the City Council. City Council last night directed staff to start a mobility study in the Lower Town area, so that will direct city staff to start looking at potential project scopes to start determining the cost of that. Rainbow Childcare off of Nixon Road near Clegg Middle School, that was postponed last evening. There were concerns expressed about the adequacy of communication with the Ann Arbor Public Schools and traffic issues associated with that site plan. The Midas site plan was approved, and the Treeline Master Plan is the newest document incorporated into the city's official list of approved master plans. As it relates to Unified Development Code, a couple of meetings, and we'll probably touch on this later, but a public meeting was held regarding that on the 12th, I believe. We've also completed our office hours for the public or users to come in and do a deeper dive. The December office hours are now complete. We still have some remaining scheduled for January. And I am proposing the cancellation of both the December 26th Ordinance Revisions Committee and the January 3rd Planning Commission meeting based on a lot of members being unavailable, and particularly for the third item, unless something were to be deferred this evening, no scheduled business.
All right, thank you, Mr. Levitt. The council has been very busy. Thanks for the rundown on those things. And were you going to mention something about the medicinal marijuana?
Yes. So, thank you for the reminder. I was proposing to add it to the agenda this evening, but since we have a relatively small commission here this evening, I think what I'm going to do is send out an email to follow up with you. I'm not looking for any decision, of course, from the Planning Commission in that, but on now that the medical marijuana zoning ordinance has been adopted, provisioning centers are the most common use of types of facilities thus far that have expressed interest and are currently existing in the city. The majority of districts we've identified through the adopted zoning ordinance as special exception use permits. So what I'm going to do is frame to you, of course, our existing ordinance standards, both for special exception uses and the adopted medical marijuana zoning. I'd like to sort of send that out to all of you as a bit of a prime and get you thinking if there are specific aspects of those special exception uses that are going to be particularly helpful as they start coming to this board for review. I think it's possible that we could get a fairly high volume of these, and so anything we can do to make sure that we're delivering, from a staff perspective, a complete information packet to you so you can make decisions on these special exception uses would be helpful. So again, they're going to be a pretty typical special exception use as other uses in our district, but just because of the potential for a slightly elevated volume, I would like to get you thinking if there are specific aspects of that particular use that we can make sure that we're teeing up information-wise for your decisions.
Great, I appreciate your forethought on that. It seems like this makes sense for the commission to give some thought to what we'd like to see to help streamline the process, and knowing that this is a new uses with the new ordinance coming through, that would be a good idea. So look forward to just getting that from you. Item 6C is planning communications from Planning Commission officers and committees. Is there anything to report out? Yes. Sorry, the echo is bothering me a little bit.
It's a little loud. So the ZBA, just one item from, I think it was November, ZBA. The Brixmore Property Group, which is the people doing the LA Fitness, requested a variance for signs, and that variance was rejected. So they were asking for 246 square feet of signage.
Keep going.
And the ordinance specifies 200 square feet. And then there was some confusion during the meeting. I don't know if you remember that LA Fitness on Maple, they had some lighted signs on the front. They did not consider that part of their signage. The ZBA said that, or the planning department said it was, so there was some confusion. And I don't know if they're coming back, but either way, their request for a variance was denied.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Weatherby. Any other communications from committees? Okay. We have a few written communications and petitions in your packet. Draw your attention to those. Some are for items tonight, some are for other items that have been under consideration by the commission. This takes us to item 7, which is audience participation. And this is an opportunity for members of the community here to speak to the commission about any item that's not on the public hearing agenda this evening. So the capital improvements plan and the amendments to our zoning ordinance, what we refer to as Zorro, or the Unified Development Code.
And I would like to say, I hope you all start using your microphones. I have hearing aids on right now and I can't hear you.
We are all using our microphones. But anything beyond those two, you may speak for up to 3 minutes, and I would ask you if you come up to the microphone and use the microphone, of course, and identify yourself by name and address. If there's anyone who would like to speak on an item not on a public hearing tonight.
I'm going to be speaking later on an item. My name is Jeff Crockett. I live at 506 East Kingsley. And I'll be speaking later in behalf of the 04th Ward Association. And we've been very busy recently because we've been immersed in providing input on the Broadway Main Lane project and also the Glen Ann Street project. But one of the arguments that came out of the council was that as a result of passing these two projects, we're going to be getting a lot of money, okay, tax money. And I think there were some estimates, you know, for the Broadway Main Lane, $4.5 million a year eventually when that all gets built up. And in behalf of our organization, we've had a real problem sometimes connecting with building department staff in regards to enforcement. And it seems like this is a real weakness with our current system, is we simply don't have enough enforcement staff for the ordinances. So I would encourage you all, and I'm hoping Brett will agree to this, getting more staff, but I would encourage you all to consider arguing as we get all this development downtown is to hire more enforcement staff. Because if we go through the process of changing the ordinance, what point is there if we don't have people to enforce it? Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Anyone else like to address the commission in this public time? Okay, seeing no one, we'll go on to a public hearing scheduled for our next business meeting, and we don't have any on this agenda, which takes us to our regular business item. Each item will feature a staff report, followed by a public hearing and commission discussion. If an item is tabled, it will most likely be rescheduled to a future date, and if you'd like to know when that is, please be sure to sign up on the sheet on the podium or on the table on the side here if you're not already on our list of the Gulf delivery list. The first item is the capital improvements plan for 2019 through 24. This plan is comprised of updated financial data for fiscal year 2019 projects contained in the approved fiscal year 2018 through 23 capital improvements plan. In addition to changes to project schedules, upon adoption by the City Planning Commission, the CIP becomes a supporting document for the city's master plan, and it's also used as a source document for the city's capital budget planning. Ms. Gosling is going to provide us with a brief overview of the CIP.
Yeah, and and I'm just going to steal a sentence or two before she gets started. As a reminder, we've presented this draft capital improvements plan to you at a working session. It's also been available publicly on the website. One particular aspect, in addition to the proposed decision on the capital improvements plan before you, was the Planning Commission was forwarded a lot of, several suggestions from the Transportation Commission. I think it would be helpful in the context of either separately or in the context of consideration of the capital improvements plan to also weigh in on whether or not there are particular components of those recommendations that you'd like to see the city follow up on for the next capital improvements plan or not. So while that's not critical to happen at the same time in the capital improvements plan, I think we've had some time to think about them. From a staff perspective, they seem like a logical direction for us to start moving in, but I would just like to sort of tag that on to your consideration of the plan itself.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard.
Sounds good, and per the summary, since you've already had a work session, I'm going to keep this very brief, very high level primarily, because it's a public hearing for the record, and in case there's anyone in the audience. So as we said, technically the resolution that's before you is for adoption of the fiscal year 2019 to 24 capital improvement plan, but essentially it's adjustments to fiscal year 19, which is the current year that will be, capital budget will be approved for this spring. So just some super summary information. The original funding need for fiscal 19 was approximately $149 million. In the revised one, it's approximately $96.7 million. So that went down quite a bit, but it was driven heavily by two transit projects, the connector and the train station moving back a year. And then also, there were a couple of fairly high-dollar Housing Commission projects that didn't get funded in 18 that moved into 19. The net out was a lower number. Just some summary stats again. There were 33 projects that had funding adjustments, 51 that had schedule adjustments, 27 that had both funding and schedule adjustments, and then there were 11 projects added. We generally do not add a lot of projects in modification years, but needs do arise. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of those added projects because they also tie into the Transportation Commission recommendations. So there was some specific interest by the Transportation Commission to bring more focus to safety and to make it a little clearer in the CIP. So we've added a school safety improvement, sort of a bucket that we can draw from. There also happen to be, these come up as schools request them, a Safe Routes to School for Northside STEAM and a school safety project for Fuller Road sidewalk gap. That's in the area where we had the unfortunate fatality a year or so ago. A couple other things, tree line initial implementation was added right now as a placeholder because we do not have any dollars. However, as all of you heard, there's a business plan being formed. So assuming that something comes out of that and funds are raised, there's a place that we can begin to implement the tree line project. And there are a couple of others that tie to DDA projects. They decided to move forward with the William III Estate Protected Bike Lane project, the parking structure expansion at Ann Ashley going up, and a couple of other more maintenance-oriented projects. And then also City Council during capital budget last year asked staff to continue forward with the actual design on the Nixon corridor following what had been the sort of general traffic study of that whole corridor, really all the way from M14 down to the roundabout at Huron Parkway. Also, we've created an Allen Creek watershed sort of bucket project and decided, since we're working on Hoover and Green, which fall in that area, that we would put some of that bucket money to stormwater capturing projects on that. So basically, those are the changes in a nutshell. As you said, you have the details. We've been over them a little bit. So the only thing I'm going to spend just a quick moment on, the Transportation Commission recommendations. I believe you have a copy of a memo, and we went over that also briefly at the work session. And from a staff standpoint, we basically said the implementation of most of these would have to come next fall, particularly the restructuring of alternative transportation into basically transit and instead of alternative active transportation, because that'll take some reprogramming of the databases that generate the plans. And a couple of other ones that I think you've seen in here. So basically, staff, responded that these are all implementable through the CIP. So that's basically it, and after the public hearing, I'll be available for questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Gosling. So just as a reminder to folks that this is the second year of a two-year budget cycle on the CIP, so this is not a full-blown, from the ground up look at this from a budget. We make some adjustments. I'm going to now open the public hearing for this. If you would like to address the commission, please come up to the podium, state your name and address for the record, and you may speak for up to 3 minutes.
This for capital improvements?
Capital improvements, yes.
Yeah, Ethel Potts, maybe you can hear me without the microphone, I don't know. I have a louder voice than anyone else in this room, but this detail by detail, the capital improvements program is really important to the public. The public should be here. They should be telling you about that. What happened, the way it works is you make sort of a blanket recommendation for all of it. And then council deals with project by project as it comes up. That's where the public comes out, sometimes in large numbers, depending on what the capital improvement is. And so I think what I would like for you to do is look at and think about each project, see if you have problems with it, see if you think this is suitable for Ann Arbor, because what you are doing when you approve this is you are making a recommendation to council for the benefit of Ann Arbor, for the benefit of the city. So I would like to think that I understood what you were recommending and why. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff Crockett, 506 East Kingsley. I wasn't expecting to speak on this, but we live on a section, East Kingsley, between Division and State, that is filled with deep potholes. And I looked on here for East Kingsley, and I guess this is more of a question perhaps for Mr. Leonard at some point, but my question is, how would I find out in the future where East Kingsley is in terms of slated for capital improvements? That's my question. I would imagine there's been capital improvements to Ann Street and Catherine, and I think to Lawrence, so it seems like it's sort of headed our way. So it'd be helpful to know at what point East Kingsley is scheduled. So that's my question.
Okay, we'll see if we can answer that one for you. I can't tell you off the top of my head, but
That's okay.
but Ms. Goslin might be able to tell us when that is in the plan, or if it is in the plan. So.
Or by email or something
Yeah.
later. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to address the commission on this item? All right, seeing no one, I'm going to close the public hearing, and I'll start by reading the motions. It's actually a rather long motion, and then we'll have commission discussion and a vote. The proposed motion reads, whereas Section 1:185 of the Ann Arbor City Code requires that the City Planning Commission annually prepare a capital improvements program for the ensuing six fiscal years, whereas the fiscal year 2018 to 2023 capital improvement plan was approved by the Ann Arbor City Planning Commission on January 18, 2017 as a supporting document for the city's master plan, and whereas the fiscal year 2018 through 2023 CIP was approved with minor adjustments by the Ann Arbor City Council on May 15, 2017 as the basis for the fiscal year 2017 capital budget, whereas the second year of the fiscal year 2018 through 2023 CIP has been adjusted based on current conditions as related to the adjusted fiscal year 2018 capital budget to be considered by the City Council, and whereas a duly noticed public hearing was held by the City Planning Commission on December 19, 2017, resolved that the City Planning Commission hereby approves the fiscal year 2019 through 24 capital improvements plan as a supporting document for the city's master plan. Ooh, can I have a council or a commissioner move this? Commissioner Milstein and Commissioner Mills seconding. Commission discussion. Anyone have some questions, comments? Commissioner Mills.
I apologize. Sorry. I apologize. I wasn't at the working session, but I've seen your presentation multiple times, so I know how this works. But I've got a couple questions on specific projects, and so forgive me if they've already been addressed. The first one is at last night's council meeting or whenever it was, the Lower Town Mobility Study, that obviously came into play after this was put together. So can you share with us how, if there is movement starting on that, how that would then fit into this?
That's a good question. Studies keep getting murkier. So that was brought up by council, you're saying? So when council puts forth projects, generally they fund them. And studies we continue to put in the capital improvement plan if we know about them at the time we prepare this. but technically they're not in the capital budget anyway. They're either in operation and maintenance budget, or they're just very directly funded by council, which sounds like the direction this one is going. So I don't even know the dollar value. Generally, we say if it's more than 50,000, it could go in here. If it's less, we wouldn't put a study in anyway. So we could add it to this if people, but I know nothing about the cost, or just say it's going to be funded if they've approved it anyway. It's an odd timing.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's unlike the tree line master plan. At some point, I think, in this case, it wasn't including the capital improvements plan because it didn't come up until last night. Just for a sense of scale, the last northeast area transportation plan cost about $640,000. So I think that depending on what the scope and the extent of that analysis will really determine what that cost is. And then I think, as Ms. Goslin indicated, then that'll probably, we'll be able to respond to that question a little bit better. Is that something that would have to be then considered by city council, or something that could be absorbed into existing budgets?
Good question, though.
Yeah, it was excellent. That's the first I had heard about it tonight, so.
The next one is a project that we talked about, and I'm imagining maybe this came up. The stormwater, I think, detention basin on Ann Arbor Saline. Do you know, in that neighborhood? Is that on here? Because I haven't seen ground move, and so, but I just didn't see it on here either.
Yes, you don't recognize it because from back when it's been called the Village Oaks Stormwater Basin. So it is
Okay.
in here. There is forward progress. There's actually two pieces. There's when that development goes forward, and I guess there's some activity now. The city purchased an easement for the basin to go in, and then the developer will build it. So that is slowly moving along. And then the other piece is like an outlet pipe, which is part of this project, but it's independent of the development, and we're getting close to getting the one easement that we need to do that. So that is moving forward.
Got it, and that.
No dirt move, though.
So that's what's in here, the last line in the storm.
In the storm, yes.
Water, so it was in the prior years?
Correct.
Okay. Those were the two that I had written down, but I think the gentleman in the audience asked a really good question, not just about East Kingsley, but if you wanted to remind all of us who live on an Ann Arbor street, if we want to know what the plans are for our streets, how do you find that out?
Okay, sometimes there is no answer if it isn't already on an active schedule. On East Kingsley, I'm not sure off the top of my head whether it is classified as a major or a local. If it's a major, it's not in here because it's not called out by name. If it's classified as a local, we generally just have a project called Annual Local Street Resurfacing under the street construction, and we select a significant number to be done. Having said that, I'm not aware of any immediate plans on East Kingsley, but the key person for that would be City Engineer Nick Hutchinson, because he is in charge. He's the street administrator. It never hurts for people to express interest. And we do have, we just completed another rating of the streets, haven't even parsed the statistics yet. So we do have a condition rating for every street in the city. I suspect, as this gentleman said, that Kingsley isn't rating super well. So we have, as part of a pavement asset management plan that council blessed, we don't always do worst first. Even though that's what your heart wants to do, it's like to make progress on the whole thing, sometimes the worst don't get first. I think Kingsley's somewhere in the middle, though. So we're looking at ranges of treatments now, everything from, the stadium where you tear it down to nothing and do it. We're trying to get away from that. We do straight up resurfacing, where you take off all or most of the asphalt but don't really do anything to the gravel base. And then we have capital preventive maintenance treatments, which may just, like on Ann, that's what we did, is we took off, a reasonable amount try to improve rideability and stuff until it's ready for a big fix. So the next treatment it gets could be a number of things. So Nick Hutchinson, city engineer, would be the best contact.
Okay. And is it also good for people if, when they have problems with potholes and things, to report it on the Fixit?
Yes, for day-to-day routine maintenance, A2 Fixit is the perfect way. Those requests come in, they're tracked, you know, there's reports to say if they're taken care of, closed out. So for routine maintenance, that's absolutely the way to go.
Okay. And I'll just elaborate on something you said, that it's not always the worst streets, even though that seems like that would be logical to get done first, but sometimes it's tied to other projects, water main replacements and things like
Yes.
that, and those things have to occur in sync with those other improvements, so.
Right, and the one thing I'll say is Kingsley right at, like the whole Fifth area, Fifth is going to be done, and that runs into Kingsley, so there'll probably be some work, isolated work on Kingsley affected by the Fifth project, but not a Kingsley project right now.
So a group of irate citizens marching toward Nick is not a good thing.
No, I'm saying anything helping to draw attention never is a bad thing.
And I would always encourage you to, of course, let your council person know of
Yep.
issues in the community.
Yep, that's what a lot of people also take that route, and some email directly, some go through their council. Either way is great.
Other Commissioner Weatherby.
So I have a question, and this is, I know that you all, the planning department and staff have talked about this, but there's one that I know here, and I'm just sort of wondering, like, how things are, like, what takes precedence? So the Hoover and Green, so there's a lot of things about the Hoover and Green intersection. So it's potentially part of the tree line, there's going to potentially be a development there, there's street upgrade. What sort of takes precedence, you know, in a situation like that? And I assume that's just one I know of. I assume there are other ones, you know, which comes first and which is kind of given precedent?
It is usually driven by whichever need is the greatest. So like street are prioritized as a bucketful, water main, sewer, storm. And then we have to sit down and say, well, this might be the highest priority street and the water's here, or sometimes it's the water driving it, or it could be the storm. So both Hoover and Green were already on the resurfacing list. And we weren't really intending to do stormwater improvements because we tend not to do those unless we're totally reconstructing. But we said, here's an opportunity. It's an area also that the stormwater modeling study identified, you know, Allen Creek in general,
Right there.
but also a couple of specific things in that area. And then the tree line, if we're going to resurface, depending on what the nature of those, whether that was the permanent or the temporary thing, they will be looking at if there are any tree line elements, even in a simple resurfacing, that we can work in.
Okay.
That one took us a little bit by surprise because, you know, it came along, but they're still absolutely going to look at what the elements are in there. They may be too sweeping, and there's not the budget to do, depending on what they call for, and they haven't done detailed design in the tree line,
Right.
but that I assume would move up in priority given this project, so.
Okay, great, thank you.
Other questions, comments from commissioners? Commissioner Trudeau.
I don't have anything specifically on this motion, but I would like to follow up after we vote on this, just to see if we want to recommend to staff to take up the recommendations from Transportation Commission.
Excellent.
We discussed those at the working session, but I don't know if we've actually expressed anything as a body to staff.
Yeah,
But I can summarize those too.
Okay. I'd like to just share that I think that, you know, in the years that I've been on the commission, I've seen the process really develop from the staff perspective and get more informed, more sophisticated in terms of the amount of input they get and the rating system. And that's also been influenced, I think, in a very positive way by commissioners who have been involved with the process to make it a very good tool for planning. It's not just plucked out of the air. I know if you're not in the process, it might seem like, where did this all come from? But there's a very detailed development process, and it's not, it's still in round figures. It's not these are not detailed cost estimates for these projects, but there's a lot of data that goes into putting them together, and I think it's a great service to the city in our capital planning from year to year to understand what some of these things cost and their potential. So appreciate all the work that goes into it, that you put into it, Deb. If there's no other comments, then I guess we're ready for a vote on this. I'm not going to read the motion again. All in favor of the motion as read, please raise your hand and say yes.
Yes.
Yes? That is all 6 people, so that passes. Did you want to make that comment now before we move on to the next item? And
Yeah, so just to summarize, from the working session, the recommendations from Transportation Commission that staff thought would be implementable in the next full CIP plan were to restructure alternative transportation, which is taking transit and active transportation out and separating them. And the impetus behind that recommendation is that it's really because the rail and other transportation projects are enormous in terms of dollars, and the other bicycling and pedestrian infrastructure tends to be relatively small, but there's a lot more projects. It's really hard to see those, so separating them I think helps make those distinctions clearer. Adding a bicycle network bucket similar to the sidewalk gap project bucket, so to identify dollars that are specifically dedicated to bicycle network projects, and adding a line for Washington Street Bicycle Boulevard, and then that would then get prioritized within those active transportation buckets. So those were the 3 that staff said would be implementable, and then there was another one that we sort of left open, which was something around design recommendations and prioritizing safety, which I think, I don't know if we have a strong recommendation there that in an implementable way right now, but I think those implementable pieces make sense, and I think if the body supports that, I would like to say we can recommend staff do those things, representing the Transportation Commission.
so, I don't think it's something we would vote on here this evening, but I think it is good to put those into the record, and the commission could consider putting together a memo of support. And, is there anything else you wanted to add to that, Mr. Leonard? Or?
Based on that, I think I can work towards putting together that memo of support so we can get to some action on that. Maybe I could include some of those, just some of the basis for those descriptions as well. Yep. For example, one thing that jumps out at me is, if I heard right, do we have competing bike lanes being proposed for William and Washington?
Well, that was a very specific one, but the general bicycle network thing for the commission.
I got that, yeah. So that might be one where, if we're analyzing both, from my lens, we might want to sort of take a deeper dive on that, whereas identifying the separate active transportation and mass transit might be an easier one to get to. So, so I'll work on bringing that forward at a future meeting.
All right, thank you. I'm now going to move us on to our next item, item 9B. This is the item that's been referred to as ZORO, the Zoning Ordinance Reorganization. It is amendments to repeal sections 4:16 through 4:20 and section 4:30 of Chapter 47, which deals with streets and curb cuts, and the entirety of Chapter 55 zoning, Chapter 56 prohibited land uses, Chapter 57 subdivision and land use controls, and the land development regulations and attachments A, B, C, and D. Chapter 59, off-street parking, Chapter 60, wetlands preservation, Chapter 61, signs and outdoor advertising, Chapter 62, landscaping and screening, Chapter 63, soil erosion and sedimentation control, and Chapter 104, fences, and adopt a new Chapter 55 as the Unified Development Code. We're going to start with a brief presentation by Ms. Delio, and then we're going to have a public hearing tonight. The intent is to leave that the public hearing open for our meeting in, I believe, January 17th, and we'll conclude it then and have commission discussion and action at that point. So hopefully your presentation is longer than my intro.
Yes, but I hope barely. All right. Thank you. Thank you. This is our staff report for the Unified Development Code, which include 10 chapters of the city code. The city's land use and development ordinances are, there we go. City's land use and development ordinances and regulations are scattered among 10 chapters of the code. The goal of the ZORO, which is the Zoning Ordinance Reorganization project, is to present the existing contents of those chapters in a more coherent, consistent, concise, and user-friendly manner. The new Unified Development Code, UDC, will be comprehensive, clear, usable by both seasoned professionals and the general public alike, enforceable and legally defensible, and adaptable. This project was started in 2009. There was not continuous progress. It has gone in fits and spurts, but it did start in 2009. Our first document produced was a diagnosis and annotated outline. It was a general assessment and critique of the existing land use ordinances and proposed a structure and content of the UDC. We moved through working on the use table, some rough drafts for staff review, then we had some complete drafts, and now we're on the adoption draft. The scope of the project includes these 10 chapters of city code, and we will be repealing 5 sections within chapter 47, streets, and then the entirety of the zoning ordinance, prohibited land use chapter, and I bet you that no one knew we had a prohibited land use chapter until we did this project. The subdivision and land use controls, including the land development regulations and attachments A, B, C, and D. Anyone gets a clap if they can name what are A, B, C, and D. The off-street parking ordinance, the wetland preservation ordinance, signs and outdoor advertising ordinance, landscaping and screening ordinance, soil erosion and sedimentation control ordinance, and the fence ordinance. We will be adopting then a new Chapter 55, the Unified Development Code. For a content comparison, the current codes are, as I had just listed. The UDC will have 8 articles. This is as proposed in the diagnosis and annotated outline. The order of the articles follows the most popular current format for development codes, beginning with general provisions, moving through the zoning ordinances and use regulations, development standards, and then procedures. The definition section is the last article, which is typical for a reference document. The few chapters of code that do have definitions are actually found in the front of those particular chapters. Articles 3, 4, and 5 will be the most referenced articles on a daily basis. These articles basically answer, what can I do with my property? What does it need to look like? And how can I do it? Article 3 are the use regulations. It includes 2 subsections and then many sub-subsections. It includes the permitted use table and then the use-specific standards. It is small on your screen, but you can imagine here's a chart, a 1-page snapshot of the use regulations. I have some printed if anyone would like to flip through them, if you don't already have them. One great advantage of this use table is that it goes both ways, across the rows and down the columns. All the permitted uses, all the uses are down, are on the right-hand side, left-hand side, going down the columns. The headers are all of our zoning districts. You'll be able to look things up both ways. If you're interested in a particular use, then you can look across and find out all of the zoning districts where it is located. If you want to know what uses are allowed in your district, you can look down and flip through the pages, figure out which is which. This is replacing our our pyramid-style text uses. We have had a presentation before which had a pyramid on it, and the way the zoning ordinance is currently laid out, I think this was perhaps common in it was definitely common in the 60s. The reasons why may include there was no such thing as computers and typing was hard. But they listed the uses for the first zoning district, R1A. And then the subsequent districts say everything that was allowed in the previous district plus these few more.
And so you literally had to flip back, and it was all text. After R1A, you never really got a true sense on a single page of what was allowed in the district because you had to keep flipping backwards and backward. This next part, the use-specific standards, this is where it gives the use-specific standards. For example, in the code, the family daycare centers, they're allowed on parcels that have 7,500 square feet or more. And so there's the right-hand column provides the reference after family daycare centers. Flip back to that, then you'll find the use-specific standards, what additional regulations are for that particular use. Article 4 is their development standards. It's what do I need to do, what can it look like, how good does it have to be. These are where many of the chapters have moved into. This is the longest chapter, I think, by number of, longest article by number of pages. It has the area height placement regulations, the special dimensional and site layout standards, parking standards, landscaping, streets, stormwater management, natural features, signs, outdoor advertising, fences. And Article 5 are the administrative bodies and procedures. This says, how can I do it? Who needs to approve it? What do I need to do to get this done? It identifies our various administrative bodies and officers, gives the general procedures. These are procedures that are applicable to almost every kind of petition that we have. Just the filing requirements, public notice requirements, public hearings, so on and so forth. Then the specific procedures, if you wanted, if you're interested in a zoning permit, a sign permit, a grading permit, a site plan, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, it has amendments and modifications. What to do if you want to either amend the petition that you're submitting with, say, a landscape modification, or if you want to amend something that you've already gotten approved. The last article are the definitions. We have, there are a few generalized terms and then there are specific terms. Each use is defined. We've added some graphics. We plan to add a few more. And then this is a spot where even more graphics can be dumped as time goes by. Some of the new features of this format are that it's a single chapter format. A lot of people, I think, currently go to our zoning ordinance and read through it looking for our parking requirements, because in many other communities you can do that. Here's a single chapter. You'll get every regulation that you need in one spot. A use table, that is probably arguably the single greatest feature improvement that we have. I think my co-manager, Kevin, will say we could have stopped there. It has a comprehensive index. No chapter of city code, none, have an index. We have a navigation bar. I have a little sample in the bubble there. It'll tell you on each page what article you're in, what section, and what subsection. There is no chapter of current city code that has any type of navigation bar. I believe it has that chapter. We've got clear section and subsection titles, even though this one is not clear, it's been cut off. That are frankly intuitive. I have in the example in the staff report one of our worst examples of a bad heading. All defined terms are capitalized. This will give an indication if we mean something very specific. When we say development, we mean one thing. We mean a specific thing. All defined terms are capitalized. This also sets us up in the future for then having a document that is hyperlinked, that is searchable online, but you know what I'm saying? It sets us up for further of an interactive and a smart document. And we've added some graphics. First and foremost, this project was not about substantive changes. This was about reformatting and reorganizing the current code. But we ran into some issues where we did have to make some substantive changes. The one would be a definition for every permitted use. By just the very nature of defining every permitted use, there's now a definition. There is no room for interpretation of what is a shopping center. It's defined. Also, the definition of floor area, and floor area ratio. Those are either new or different. Those are three key terms that we have defined to meet our modern way of using them. For example, we currently have a definition of non-residential floor area and residential floor area that is exceedingly difficult, and you just have to make a judgment call when you're working downtown and have a mixed-use building. However, the definitions that we are proposing are honoring our historical definitions. We are going back to, skipping over some time, and we're going back to how these definitions were applied for quite a period of time. A substantive change is the natural features, protections, and guidelines have been codified. They are not guidelines anymore, they are codified. That is a substantive change. Our nonconformities section has been clarified. We have taken pains to make sure that it has not changed too much, but we have broken out the nonconforming into 3 categories. We had 2 previously. Nonconforming buildings and uses were lumped together. We have sections for each specifically, and we have been very clear about what to do when you have what particular kind of nonconformity. Because of our pyramid style zoning, things flipped back and it said uses which regulations where things first occurred. There's no such thing as first occurred now. So we have been clear about what we expect for nonconforming situations. The site plan submittal requirements have been completely rewritten. This is a substantive change, but I don't think it will be very earth-shattering. We've just reorganized what information we expect, and we have written down the information that we've already been asking for over the years. It's just written down now, so it is very clear and it's not arbitrary. The enforcement procedures have been extensively rewritten as well. A big change is all violations are now civil infractions, and outdated language regarding misdemeanors has been deleted. This chapter is also moving towards a little bit more of what we're actually doing in practice. One of the changes has been to write down and standardize our enforcement procedures. It is not currently written down, but something we typically do when we come across a violation is make a phone call. And so the order of contact and the escalating nature has been written down, and it's been standardized for all chapters that have morphed into the UDC. In our staff report, I've suggested 2 different ways for reviewing the document, because it took us 8 years to get to this point. I don't want it to take 8 years to get it approved. I would suggest approaching it from 1 or 2 sides. You can do both of them, but I wouldn't suggest both of them simultaneously. You can approach it by exploring the new format and just trying to use it. Put yourself in a hypothetical situation. If you know your zoning district, look up and see what setbacks you have and whether you can put an addition onto your home. And figuring out what to do, what rules apply, et cetera. If you are a non-conforming home, figure out what does that mean for you. If you want to put up a fence, try to see if you can figure out. That is our intended audience, is to make it easier for property owners or anyone interested in zoning to figure out what they can do, what they need to do, and how to do it without calling staff. It's not that I don't want to answer the questions, it's that it shouldn't be this complicated. You shouldn't have to call staff. There should be a method to find out your own answer. The other way to review it is, if you would like to compare and contrast the content, start by reading the footnotes. There are more than 650 footnotes, but they kind of fall into 3 categories they weren't set out to do this way, but they kind of fall into 3 categories. They just note non-substantive changes. An example would be a footnote says materials reorganized for clarity with column titles. So that explains why the text in the UDC does not exactly match the current text. The footnotes also identify substantive changes. For example, they'll say this is a new section written to clarify legal requirements. And they also list an origin reference. They'll say from section 5:64 or whatnot. And then finally, the draft in front of you is what we're calling the base draft. It has a published date of November 20th, 2017. We are continuing to edit for corrections, clarifications, grammar, punctuation, so on and so forth. We'll produce revised editions as it seemed appropriate. We'll probably have one coming up after this public hearing. And then perhaps another one after the Planning Commission recommendation, incorporating any more clarifications or any more edits that arise following the public hearings. For that, we will use the track changes format, meaning the adoption draft, November 20th, 2017, it clearly not track changes. It is impossible to do a track changes between the current ordinances and the UDC. But we will use track changes, or we'll at least have them available, so you can see what has changed since November 20th, 2017. The adopted ordinance will not have track changes in it, but these will be available, and also so we can keep track of what we've revised and what we've not. For anyone interested, we have a project website that has 2 addresses going to the same place, a2gov.org/UDC or /Zorro. We've already had 2 City Hall office hours. There are 2 more coming up in January. Following tonight's public hearing, we're asking the Planning Commission to continue it to January 17th, 2018. And you can email us at the project team at zorro@a2gov.org. We are asking the Planning Commission to not make a recommendation tonight, but to listen to any public feedback at the public hearing. Feel free to make any comments or ask questions yourselves. We're asking you to continue it to the January meeting, and then you can make a recommendation for it. We're asking this to have the broadest possible engagement period and to collect as much feedback as we can. Following that, we'll move on to City Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. DeLeo. And thank you for a great presentation, I think, and very informative, and both to you and Mr. McDonald for all the hard work and persistence in getting this to this point. It is, I know it has not always been easy. So at this point, I'll then open the public hearing, and you may speak for up to 3 minutes. Please come up to the podium, state your name and address for the record. And great.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Cora. I don't have a question. I was just wondering if you could sign this piece of paper for my class.
We'd be happy to
okay.
sign it after the public hearing is over, which I don't think it's going to be real long based on the number of
Okay.
people here today.
That's fine.
So thank you for being here tonight. Others?
I want you to know, I did defer to Epi. He is my heroine. So I did defer when she said go for it. I'm Jeff Crockett. I'm speaking on behalf of the 04th Ward Association,
Oh,
so I'm
okay.
hoping I can get a few extra minutes out of this.
You may have 5 minutes.
Okay, so basically, we are new players in this, and we were sort of unaware that this was coming. We do think it's all long overdue, and we applaud you for that. And nothing that I'm going to say should be construed to think that we're dissatisfied at all with the individuals in the building department. The people we've contacted have been very courteous. We love Jill Thatcher. She's fantastic. We've been working with John Barrett and Chris Chen, and he's been very helpful. But I must say that from our point of view, the process is very confusing. And I think the previous speaker was describing some of the substantive changes and the smaller changes. From my point of view, and I took a very shallow dive into this, it's very difficult to, first of all, I had to figure out whether there were changes at all. And it was not that clear that there were. And then when I realized that there was, I had to figure, we have to really look carefully at this. But it is going to take a lot longer than what I did. And I did send you an emails from some immediate concerns, but they were expressed out of a lack of understanding for what the timetable was. And I can tell you that our organization is very concerned about zoning, parking, and signs, and those kind of issues, and it is going to require a deeper dive. So I'm hoping we can set up an appointment with Mr. Leonard sometime before the next hearing to more thoroughly go, and perhaps to the Zorro staff also, to sort of go over more in depth some of our concerns. So it seems to be that in terms of the timetable that you're moving for approval within the next few months. I'm not sure if that's the case. So I don't know, for example, because we will have some concerns. I don't know if those concerns can alter or change what's currently in the proposed draft or not. We're hoping so. Just to provide a little context, I live at 506 East Kingsley, which is right downtown, and most of the people in our organization live right in the downtown area. So what's been happening in our area is there's been, there are a few homeowners, mostly rental, but in the past 3 and 4 years, there's been sort of a trend of landlord investors coming in, purchasing houses with cash, and then gutting the interiors, and then increasing the density, and then as a result of that, expecting that their increased tenants are going to get more parking. So I immediately focused in on the parking definition, and I'm not sure if this was a typo or not, but the old definition referred to the parking lot as a total surface area on a parcel of 1,200 or more square feet or 5 parking spaces. So that meant that either the 1,200 square feet standard applied to a parking lot or the 5 spaces, which is really important to us because in the new definition it talks about that the standard is 1,200 square feet and more than 4, which means that both of those conditions have to be met. So if you have a parking lot that's 1,000 square feet and you try to squeeze 10 cars on there, it doesn't require any approval, according to the way I sort of read this. And that's sort of a real concern for us that we need to sort of explore. I'm not sure if that was just a typo or if that was the active intent of the change, but it's an example of a change that we're paying very close attention to. The other thing is that what happens is that landlords want to increase, expand, and have as many parking spots as they can, particularly in areas that are smaller than 1,200 square feet. So I'm proposing basically that we have another designation other than parking lot, and calling it parking area to reflect those parking areas that are less than 1,200 square feet. Because basically, if you have a standard for a size of a parking stall in a parking lot, but you don't have it for a smaller area, it means that you can have a whole bunch of cars parked in a very small area. So those are changes we want to talk about. The last thing I want to talk about is the process of enforcement. And it's very unclear when enforcement goes wrong is who we should contact. And there's a disconnect between A2 Fixit and enforcement. So basically, you report something in A2 Fixit, and they have something to do with parking. It gets deferred to parking enforcement, but we don't know who it gets referred to. So there's no way to respond. So I'm hoping to connect with Mr. Leonard and with the Zora folks sometime in the next few weeks. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for your comments, Mr. Crockett. Oops.
I think I want to speak, Ethel Potts, I want to speak more generally about the process. From the middle of December to the middle of January to take on this project is pretty ludicrous. Where's the public? There's been one public meeting scheduled and held. 5 people were there, plus 1 commissioner. Here we are, here's number 1 public hearing, and you'll have a follow-up public hearing in January. Are you hearing me? Can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay. This has been, Zorro started, I think, a long time ago, like 2009, was it? You know, and ever since then, we've been waiting. I went to some of the early Ordinance Revisions Committee meetings at which it was discussed and presented. There were other bodies that were represented, like the Zoning Board of Appeals and so forth. Unfortunately, it was chaired by someone who had one issue in mind only. It would not let them talk about anything else except floor area ratio, which is important, but it's not the only thing that goes on in town. So I'm imploring you to include the public. You are making no efforts, as I can tell so far, to include the public. It's only by chance that I know about this. And the public is interested. Last night's public hearing at council, there were a whole neighborhood have become expert on zoning. They care. They know about it. They were there. Why are they being excluded from this? Not one of them was notified about this. I can't think of a neighborhood in town that's been notified. Back when all of this started, and I finally got a copy through connections, I came to commission and recommended that everybody stop using their other versions of the ordinance and use only Zorro. Use only Zorro to read your packet, to make your decisions. What that would do is, what it did that's what I did. What it did is it put Zorro to the test. And let me tell you, in some ways it worked, in some ways it completely failed. What they had done, what the structure has taken, here's an issue. They've cut it in pieces, put it in different sections, and never tell you what page those are on, so you can't find them. The index gives you one page number for a whole category, but they don't tell you that most of the category is somewhere else. So it was very badly organized, so I finally gave up using it. I finally went back to my old paper copies. So please start including the public at some point. Two of us are not the public.
Thank you for your comments. And Abby, whoops, let me stop that. And just with due respect, there have been a number of times when certainly all the public hearings and the public meetings have been posted on the city's website. They've been publicly noticed. There have been ordinance revision committee meetings. And in January, when we continue this public hearing, it won't be the last time that the public has an opportunity. Even if the commission were to pass it at that meeting, it still has to go to city council for first and second readings. So there
Will begin in January.
So there are other opportunities as well. So is there? I think everyone who is here from the public has addressed the commission. So I'm not going to close the hearing because we're going to keep it open for the January 17th meeting. But I appreciate your comments, and I think that certainly it's possible to follow up with staff on questions about parking. I will reiterate one thing that Ms. Delio said, which was that they've attempted to do as little tinkering with the actual requirements of the ordinance as possible. So there are some instances that they've noted that where they've had to do that as part of the clarification process, but they've not gone back and, say, revisited parking standards. The thought is that once this reorganization is done, there may be a second round of things that need to get addressed coming out of that. But we are attempting to make this as transparent as possible and to make as few changes, substantive changes to the existing ordinance as possible to avoid it being a problem for people to see what's happening with the ordinance, even though it's really confusing.
Because there's so few people, possible to ask a question to informally or
Maybe at the end of the meeting.
Yeah, I would suggest that, there's another public, actually, right after this is another public process for that. So I am going to take us on to the next, which is audience participation. So if you want to come up and ask a question, that would be fine.
I thought we just had.
Do you have any thoughts on the ordinance?
Are we trying to encourage commission discussion right now? Commissioner Weatherby?
I just have more of a question for
Just
the,
if there's something that we can follow up on before the next
I
meeting.
I understand.
yep, for the project, as I was sort of looking through it, I did find a few things that I either had questions on, or there was like one footnote I saw didn't have a corresponding footnote. What's the best way for us to, like, send in a list of questions or edits, or how would we best do that?
I'd say if you have a question that's a more general or broad question that the commission might benefit from, by all means, pose it and we can try to address it. But if it's a edit type thing, why don't you just email it? If you happen to have them handwritten, you can drop them off. I can take them now, or you can just email them in, or screenshots or hand notes.
Okay, so however.
But I guess
And
the.
to that, zorro@a2gov.org.
Yes, and then basically somehow get them to either myself, Kevin, or Brett, and then we'll divvy up the task.
Okay. And then I just had one other question about that I'm going to not remember. I'll have to.
Happens all the time. Any
So
other
if you have
questions?
questions, then I think emailing them. Commissioner Woods?
First of all, it seems like it's been longer than 9 years, because you were a teenager when we started this.
I know. I didn't even have a driver's license.
But, but I'm sure it's been a work of love the whole time. But I think perhaps also it might be helpful for someone to mention, in terms of the public, whether or not the goal here is to unify it, to put it together so that it makes sense. It's not to necessarily find something within the regulations that we want to change, per se, correct?
Right.
Correct.
So
The goal was a reorganization and a reformatting. We did blow up the current codes, which were basically, we blew up the silos. There was an entire chapter devoted to parking. There was, within the zoning chapter, it contained everything you kind of wanted to know about the Zoning Board of Appeals, say. But it was all in their individual unique categories. Each one of those chapters had its own intent statement. Each one had its own couple of definitions. Each one had its own enforcement section. For variances, it said, well, here's the criteria maybe for a variance, but you also have to go back, somehow find the Zoning Board of Appeals. And we have reorganized it from those silos to just in a different format. And now everything you want to know about the Zoning Board of Appeals is not going to be found in one section. What you're going to find is everything you want to know about how to file something is going to be found in a section. How to file for a variance is in the filing section. The criteria for approval, what the Zoning Board of Appeals is going to use, that's going to be found in the criteria for approval section. That kind of thing. But also, there's one intent statement for the entire document. There is one definition section. There's not 10 definition sections. So we did deliberately blow it up and re-put it back together. But what I can assure you is all the pieces are there. And what is now apparent is some of it is very awkwardly worded, or some of it is surprising that is what the code says. We deliberately didn't change that. That is for a different project. Now that it's so much easier to read, things like this are becoming, it says that's our standard. And, but we've made a conscious effort to not change it, to not do a substantive change. It is what it is, we're gonna live with it, but we can now follow it up right on the heels of adopting the UDC with the substantive change that we want. Parking lots, shouldn't be 1,200 square feet and 5 cars. Okay, fine, but we'll have a process to talk about that amendment, but this is for a reorganization. But I will, like I said, harping on it, but we did on purpose split apart all the sections and then reorganize them like from like. So, yeah.
Just also to just to add to that, because you were talking about the intent of the project, and in working with Don Elliott, our consultant from Clarion, who's done this kind of all over the country, including Philadelphia and Albuquerque and other much larger cities than this whole project was designed, not to not have the public present. We certainly want the public as involved as possible, and we want all the feedback from the public. But if we did our jobs appropriately, you should not really have a room full of people here, unless they're concerned about the format or things like that, because we're trying to, of course, be non-destructive in the work that we were doing. And so what people really should have is kind of the same ordinance in front of them. We had to make some decisions, but quite frankly, along this project, when we were having public meetings, when we don't see a certain number of people, he sees that as sort of, oh, well, we're doing the right thing then, because you don't have people coming forward in front of you saying, well, there's 40 problems here, there's 50 changes. And so I want to be very clear, that doesn't mean we haven't been reaching out and sort of having office hours and having meetings and things. But for example, I think at least the last couple of meetings we've had, you know, when I talk to him, he kind of shrugs his shoulders because that's kind of what he sees in other communities as well. People will come, and especially, you know, when you're adopting this maybe next week, and when it gets to council, we'll see people. But I just thought I'd kind of state that was part of the intent, of course, to not have a situation where this project kind of gets to the end point, and then you have lots of people saying, hey, there's too many changes here. It was not supposed to be about that. It was supposed to be about creating the format so that the ordinance would be more adaptable at a later time, that it'd be easy to change later. So we try to be as non-destructive as possible.
Thank you for the clarification. Any other Commissioner Mills?
This is following up on what was just said and kind of putting into the context of some of the comments that we got tonight. I think, Mr. Crockett, the items that you went through in your letter are really useful. I think it identifies places where, now that we can read this, that's what's to come. I think the first concern that you have about that and versus or, that is something that is what we're hoping we get. That's something that if it's a change from what our current ordinance says, that we need to, those are the things that we want to correct before this gets passed. The things that we would like to see because we don't like what the ordinance says right now, those are the things that are for Zorro 2.0.
We understand.
Okay. So I really appreciate you pointing that out because it is only 3 letters or 2 letters, but it makes a big difference, right?
For us, yeah.
So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Any other commission comments for this evening? Okay. So we'll move on then to the audience participation. So if you would like to.
So just
In
as a point of-
talking to my fellow neighbors, fellow advocates,
1 second, please.
Did you need to postpone this? Or
Do we need to vote on postponing? We didn't take it up.
you
The public hearing is staying open.
trying to think?
Is there a procedural?
Yeah, we probably need to say it then.
I can say that this item is postponed until the January 17th Planning Commission meeting, January 17th, 2018 Planning Commission meeting, just to be clear.
yeah, you're clearly not acting on it tonight, the Zorro.
We are clearly not acting on Zorro tonight, yes.
Yes. I just wanted to say that you may be hurting more feelings than you know by leaving people out. The people I talk to feel quite offended to not be notified, to have no way of knowing that this is going on. Now, I can put out my networks and tell, but that's not fair to all the other people that I don't know. Why should I just, the only people be notified be people I happen to know? So I think you really need to make an effort to include the public. And 2 or 3 people here and there is not the public. Not in Ann Arbor, when they have 2-hour-long public hearings on issues like zoning, then you know Ann Arbor is interested. So it has occurred to me a couple of times to bring some of my problems to you, to come to a planning commission and at public time hand you one of my Zorro problems and let you all take it home and solve it and see if you can do it. I might, I may get around to that, but who knows? In any case, that's a sort of a veiled threat. Sorry.
And Epi, I can also say you can bring questions to us certainly, or to staff to help work through those things. If there's things that you find confusing, they have had office hours in the month of December, where they've been open for anyone to come and ask questions. And those may be some additional ones that happened in 2018. I don't think they've been scheduled yet, but are they scheduled? Yep. Okay. Oh, thank you. Duh. It's right here. So January 10th from 5 to 8 p.m. on Wednesday, January 11th from 3 to 6 p.m. Our City Hall office hours. I'm assuming you come to the Planning and Development Department. Is that on my screen too?
The first floor conference rooms.
First floor conference rooms, okay. So there are 2 dates set up right now. If you want to come and ask questions on those dates, and if those don't work, I'm sure you could reach out to Alexis and should accommodate you at another time.
Is this going to be both Brett and Alexis at these office hours, or do we need to schedule something separate from that? Or should we be, well, maybe I should get up. I'm a little unclear.
Sure, the office hours are staffed by the project managers, which is Alexis from
Okay.
planning and Kevin McDonald from the city
And
attorney's
I will
office.
admit, I have not scheduled office hours yet. I will.
You,
but
you don't
not
have to
for
schedule.
another
You are welcome to drop in at any time. Anytime. There's no slots there, so just come anytime.
So on those hours that are listed, you can show up anytime in those hours and they'll be there.
Oh, that's
And I don't think there's been a huge long line at the earlier ones, so.
Well, is there a limit to the number of people we bring to the?
I think the room holds 10.
Okay, no. I very much appreciate. Oh, that was it. Boy, they didn't like me.
Sorry. It had started earlier.
Very much appreciate the fact that those small detail changes will get corrected, and we'll sort of, talk about that. The other thing that was a little confusing is we're very invested in the sign ordinance, and we've been connecting with Chris and providing input, and it was a little confusing to know whether the changes in the UDC or the Zorro that are being posted now were reflective of the new sign changes or not, and Chris said they
They're not,
weren't.
no.
So that's really good. The other thing I wanted to say, I understand now that the intent of this is to basically transfer information over to Zorro. It's not necessarily to change some of the content. We were very invested in wanting to change the sign ordinance, and we're also very invested in trying, as I mentioned before, a couple points about changing the parking ordinance. So I understand that that is for a future day, but I do want to say in behalf of the Old Fourth Ward Association that we're very concerned about what's happened in the trends about parking, increased off-street parking, landlords trying to cram as many cars in there. And then the other problem is the difficulty in enforcement. And there's one other thing I want to talk about. There is the Zorro provisions for parking. There's also the Historic District Guidelines, which are sort of an additional set. And my suggestion is to reference the Historic District parking guidelines in this document, because otherwise someone going through this who's not familiar with the Historic District will just assume that what's in the Zorro document are the parking restrictions. And in fact, that there are some additional parking restrictions from the HDC guidelines. And so it would be helpful to point that out, I would think. And I'm not sure if there's a way to do that, but we can certainly discuss that. So, and a little bit about A2 Fixit, just clarifying that a little more, is that we've submitted a number of complaints about parking, but it's a little confusing if you have a car that's parked on the side of the house, which is incorrect, like you can report it through A2 Fixit, but it's unclear whether the police do this or whether it's zoning. It's who enforces it that's a little confusing to us. And if we could have some clarifying statement with, if a car is parked in this situation, who takes care of it? Or is it the police department? Is it sort of a zoning infraction? So it would be helpful to sort of clarify that so we knew who to report these violations to.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on, not an expert on that, but I would assume that if a car is parked illegally, that would be something you would report to the police.
Not on the side, we've talked this over with Jill, and the police won't go after cars that are illegally parked on lawns, on private property, backward on the property. That's a zoning, they said it goes through A2 Fixit, but then they refer it to somewhere, and that's where our problem is. We simply don't know. The police won't, so it would be helpful to clarify what the police will respond to and what they won't in regards to parking
Yeah,
and
and
off-street parking.
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that, so yeah, it's something we can,
Thank you.
sure. We're now at commission proposed business, and I have two things. One is, I think, Mr. McDonald, did you have something that you were trying to say a couple minutes ago? I would propose to give you a moment if there was something that we...
Well, I appreciate it. I really just wanted to reiterate that we have all kinds of different ways for people to contact us. So if people are watching at home, the best thing for you to do is to go to the website, which if you Googled Ann Arbor and Zorro, or just a2gov.org/Zorro, all of the information of the project is there. The schedule of what we're doing is there, including the office hours. And I just wanted to state that the office hours are January 10th from 5 to 8 and January 11th from 3 to 6, as you've already said. But the purpose of those office hours are really for people to get any questions that they have about the Zorro project answered or the zoning. So Alexis and I will be, pardon me? Yeah, on a one-on-one basis. So people can come in with questions if they, or else if they just want to learn about the project. And so we're there to answer people's questions. There's no reason to have any sort of appointment. You can just come in and talk to us. And if people need other times, we will make ourselves available. So also, for using the project webpage, you can email Zorro, which will reach us directly, and we're happy to meet with you or talk to you or do whatever we can to answer questions about the project.
Thank you. Appreciate that, and I'm sure folks in the community will as well. Under commission proposed business, is there any other business the commissioners would like to propose for this evening? If not, I have one piece of proposed business. I'd like to propose that the commissioners enjoy a wonderful holiday break, and we'll see each other in 2018. And of course, spend some time reading your new ordinance so you can be familiar with it come January. I believe that is correct.
Yes. And the January 9th working session is scheduled. I'm still putting together the agenda on that. A couple of possibilities are one project, just for some very preliminary feedback from the Planning Commission. And I'm still trying to get the traffic impact study session scheduled. That's a possibility for that date, but none of those are confirmed yet.
Okay. Anything else from commissioners? That takes us to number 12, adjournment. Do we have Commissioner Milstein and Commissioner Weatherby seconded? All in favor, say yes. Yes. Yes, we are adjourned. Thank you all.